Now, in Legal Talk today, we welcome back Nicolene Skuman-Low, attorney and managing director of Skuman Law Incorporated. And as I mentioned earlier, we've covered so many cases in our consumer slot with Wendy Nola of people who have been taken in by scam artists online, fake websites selling fake goods or not selling anything at all, just simply wanting to snap up your credit card details and deprive you of your hard-earned cash. We thought today we'd look at these stories from a different perspective, from the legal perspective, the legal implications, which laws are being broken by such sites, and most importantly, what your legal recourse is if you have fallen victim to one of these con artists. It's always a pleasure to have Nicolene Skuman-Low with us. Welcome back to the show, Nicolene.
Thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to have you with us again. I think most people by now, sadly, have come across them in one way, shape or form, but unfortunately, Nicolene, a lot of people fall for them. Should we maybe start by taking a look at what they look like, how they present themselves to the public, and what you actually mean when you're talking about a fake or scam website? What should we be looking out for?
Absolutely. Firstly, I think it's a website that kind of looks like a brand, but not quite. Maybe that logo seems a little faint. Maybe the brand voice just seems slightly different to what you are usually accustomed to, and it is everywhere. It could even be that the domain name looks slightly different, or the email that you receive when placing an order or filling in a online form, maybe of reacting to some offer, seems different to what you're accustomed to. Just maybe it looks like there's a typographic error. And these should all be big warning lights to us that we may not actually be dealing with the business we think we are dealing with if these slight discrepancies do creep up. So I think it looks very, very familiar, but something is really not quite right.
Some of them are very, very convincing. I want to say, in defense of some of the people we've dealt with on this end, Nicolene, who've been taken in, they're so embarrassed by the time they write to Cape Talk that it happened to them. But I really feel for them because I've almost fallen victim to one. They are so, so clever in the way they mimic the real deal. I'm going to just share the example that I experienced because I was thinking I would buy my husband a pair of Skechers shoes for his birthday, and I wasn't sure where to find them, and I thought, let me see if there's a Skechers website. It would be so nice if I could order them online. So I typed in skechers.co.za, and it redirected me, Nicolene, to a website that was Skechers, but I think it had one letter missing. I typed in the correct spelling, but almost without noticing it, it redirected me to a site that had one letter missing from the name of the brand. And thankfully, something else in the experience when it came to paying made me think, this just doesn't feel right. I'm going to take a step back. And I actually phoned a Skechers store to say, do you have a website in South Africa? And they said, oh, no, not another one. Have you been taken in? Because they'd had so many customer complaints. But this is the trick that you go in with what you think is a legitimate web address. And then in the chain of processing through the site and looking at a picture and clicking on something, it quietly redirects you to a phishing site in the background. That's what's going on, right?
Absolutely. And I think we need to be very wary, not to think that a faint branding, grainy imaging, especially if we're dealing with such a well-known brand, if it's grainy, if it just doesn't look like international quality, that should be telling. Yeah. But I think we are scratching the surface if we think it's only an experience that leaves us with some level of doubt. These scam artists, that's essentially what they are, have become very sophisticated, and we will have to stay on top of trends, make sure that we read, make sure that we look at these stories when we see someone has been scammed. And for those of us who've fallen victim, I realize there's a sense of shame. It happened to me. Why did it happen to me? But it could also help someone else because it's always evolving. So let us definitely share. The other component to look out for is website privacy policies, compliance with POPI. So in other words, looking at that disclaimer right at the bottom of the website, do they even have one? Do they have a privacy policy when you click on the link, or does it go to someone else's privacy policy? These are telling signs that are actually quite important these days to see if this is a legitimate website, beyond looking at the domain name, that it's spelled correctly and so forth.
That's a really good tip, thank you, because that's one that unless you're a very sophisticated criminal, you might miss the fact that you need to have a POPI disclaimer at the bottom. Nicolene, maybe also just before we go on to which laws are being broken, let's talk a little bit about sort of what they're selling and how the scam works, because there's quite a lot of difference there as well. Some of them are not selling anything at all. They are hoping that you will continue to think they are the real Skechers store, fill in your credit card details, authorize a purchase, and they take your money and simply disappear with it. Some of them, though, are selling things. They're just selling counterfeit things or cheap goods. So you buy what purports to be an actual pair of Skechers, and what gets sent to you is a 100 Rand pair of cheap tackies that's going to fall apart after the first wearing. So there are quite a lot of different formats here. Some of them are offering fake investment opportunities. I mean, the number of possibilities of the form they take is basically only limited by the imagination of the scam artist, not so?
Absolutely, and as we all know, this is the oldest trick in the book, as they say. It's just taking an online face or form. So counterfeiting, big problem. The most elementary of all of this is naturally to place an order that never gets fulfilled. And often the scam artist is someone that is unidentifiable. So in many instances, we are unable to even retrieve the spend or the money. In some instances, your credit card details then become compromised, and other unauthorized purchases then inevitably follow, a form of identity or payment theft, payment detail theft. And then, of course, the counterfeiting or being misrepresented in what you are actually procuring. So it's important that if we're working with legitimate international big brands, that we actually see that there's a link back, that there's reputation. Go online, see if there's reviews, how long have these guys been around. At the bottom of the website, do they even disclose who owns them, company name, registration number? Go on to CIPC, see if these guys actually exist. Is this a legitimate company, registration number and name? These are some of the very basics just to keep yourself safe. And if they're new, unfortunately, it's painful. Maybe be extra wary. See if they have an actual presence. If you can actually go onto Google Maps, use the satellite, the street view, and see if the address is actually an open field or if it's an actual building, and if we can actually see the signage. Google is becoming quite strict with their verifications as well, which helps us as the consumer.
Okay, that's a fantastic check. And if there's no physical address on the website, I know Wendy Enola always says that's a massive, massive red flag. If a business can't tell you where they are located, it's a very, very big warning sign. Now, Nicolene, thanks. So you've given us tips on what they look like and what their sort of business model is, the business scam model, that is. You've also given us some tips there on how to identify them. Let's talk a little bit about what laws are actually being broken when someone creates or puts out one of these scam sites.
Now, first and foremost, let's not forget common law, good old fraud, fraud or forgery. In other words, presenting something for something it is not. Good old fraud under common law. That is a criminal offense, right? So if there's any prejudice or damage that has been suffered, then more so there could also be a civil claim to that. But it's important to open a case with the local police. If it's involving electronic means, it becomes a cybercrime under the new Cybercrimes Act of 2020, the newest piece of legislation aiming to keep all of us safe online. So it's really important to go and report that. We cannot track how successful this new piece of legislation is if we are not reporting it. So first and foremost, don't forget, this is common law fraud, which is a criminal act, and if we use any form of technology in doing it, social media, website, whatever the case may be, then it becomes a cybercrime. Of course, if it involves any investments, then we also need to report this to the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, or the FSCA. They have a dedicated team that also puts out warnings to people to be wary of potential scams or fraudulent investment opportunities, which are then investigated and those operations shut down. So they work in conjunction with the South African Police Service. The more swiftly we act, and the better, really.
Okay.
And then, of course, Consumer Protection Act, remember counterfeit goods as well. Those are actually very, very damaging to the legitimate product, to the legitimate designer product or big brand. Any of these quote-unquote knockoff products or counterfeit good products, there's very much criminality behind that. It's not just the cheap knockoff and the damage it does to the legitimate brand, but often these are conduits for bigger unlawful syndicates, basically using that type of operation to launder money from very, very intense criminal activity.
Yeah.
So it's really important for us not to partake in that, and if we become aware of it, again, to report it to the legitimate brand, make them aware that there's a counterfeit operation going on, and also then the police services, and to get an attorney to help you if you have been a victim of this from a civil point of view, to try and get your money back, to act as soon as possible. And then, of course, Consumer Protection Act, last but not least.
Yep.
Important, we are protected by that legislation to know what we are getting ourselves into, what we are being marketed, and to report that to the tribunal. If we feel we've been victim of any knockoff or any, I thought I was buying a good quality goods online, and then I got something, I don't quite know what I got, but it didn't even last the 2 weeks down the line. Those are the types of things that may not be as damaging as some of these other criminal activities, but it's still important that we are able to create an online marketplace that we can trust, and therefore that if you are a victim of sub-quality, that you report that to the relevant site, provided it's legitimate, of course, and to the consumer tribunal as well.
Just for anybody who's come in midway to this interview, our guest on the line, Nicolene Skuman-Low, who is an attorney and the managing director of Skuman Law Incorporated, talking to us about fake websites and websites selling counterfeit goods and the scam artists who are taking advantage of unwitting consumers who fall for their very, very expert recreation of mock websites that look like the real deal but aren't actually selling us anything we want to own. John saying, is there no security company out there that can track these scams and shut down these sites? Nicolene, the problem is you shut down one, they simply reopen in another iteration. It's a really difficult thing to police, isn't it?
It is a very difficult thing to police, but if we can find out who the hosting company is that hosts this website, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, we shouldn't forget that one. It was the first generation legislation dealing with online transacting. We can still also notify the ISP and ask them for intervention as well to take down the harmful or damaging content. But unfortunately, if it's a syndicate, you chop off the one head of the snake and another one does tend to rear. There are cybersecurity companies out there that specialize in this level of investigations, often very useful from a policing point of view and very useful to report it through to other providers, such as the social providers, social medias, and so forth, that can then at least shut it down and make it difficult for them to put up another one. So that would also be quite useful. happy to chat with the listener offline to point them into the right direction.
Okay, thanks. With one eye on the clock, the most important thing I think we need to talk about is what you can do if it happens to you. Nicolene, you've already mentioned the importance of reporting it to police and opening a case of fraud or identity theft or whatever it may be. Even if you don't really feel there's much chance of them being prosecuted or located, do report it so that police know about it and can keep accurate stats on it. You've also mentioned the option of engaging a lawyer to proceed with civil action. That, of course, requires you to be able to find the perpetrator. And many times they're sitting in another country altogether, aren't they?
So that's why we as attorneys engage with investigators that can actually help us find the perpetrators.
Okay.
And if we are able to engage with any evidence that pins it on a particular person or group of people, then we are able to issue cease and desist letters. We can even bring interdict applications. There's a range of remedies we can then look at. And then, of course, if we know the identity, we can also bring a claim. So it's really useful to work hand in hand with an investigative arm. And then, of course, don't forget engaging with your bank.
Yeah.
If you have purchased something, you haven't received the goods that you've purchased or whatever the case may be, really important to report it to your bank's credit card fraud department as soon as possible. In many instances, if you do it quick enough, the banks are able to reverse these transactions if it happened on your credit or debit card.
Yeah.
So in many instances, if we act quick enough, we can at least claw back some of the money. If your card or your details have been compromised, really important to stop that card as soon as possible so that you can avoid it spiraling completely out of control.
Yeah. Last thing to say before we must say goodbye. Nicolene, you've mentioned already that one of the steps you would take is to go to the hosting company and require them to cooperate in shutting these sites down. I'm using the word require very deliberately. There is an obligation on our internet service providers to act if such a thing is reported to them, not so?
Absolutely, and that has been so since 2002 when the ECTA, or Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, was promulgated. Very few of us are actually using that mechanism. It's such an underutilized, very useful resource. So the minute we can actually track where a website is hosted, and again, in many instances, our investigative teams are quite useful that we make use of to track who does the hosting, then we are able to report it and to say, listen, we believe for these reasons that this is not a legitimate operation. You're hosting it. That means you are being complicit in what is happening here, and we will report it accordingly should you not act within your purview of your engagement with your quote-unquote client. So it's really an underutilized source. I think we should actually leverage it more. It exerts pressure on multiple fronts, which makes it really difficult for these guys to continue their illicit operations.
Nicolene Skumanlo, thank you so much. Really insightful conversation, and appreciate your flagging the red flags to look out for, as well as telling us what steps can be taken if you do unfortunately fall victim to these scam artists.